In the aftermath of the Civil War, African Americans have an opportunity for freedom and equality, but there's a backlash among white citizens, particularly in the South, of people who do not want African Americans to enjoy the full rights of citizenship that other people enjoy.
You have a shifting of the racial hierarchy. And one way to really solidify white over black again was using forms of racial terror. And one of the most acute and profound and widespread and visual forms of racial terror was the lynching of black bodies.
Suddenly, African American mobility and freedom starts to look a lot more threatening. There's a new set of narratives and stereotypes that start being circulated around black criminality.
But the reality is, many of these lynchings occurred simply because of a deep-seated racial animus or hatred toward African Americans.
If a black person were successful at a business, if a black person voted, a crime could involve any simple everyday act, and that act of simply existing in a new white society could be punished by death.
Between 1880 and 1968, there's an estimated 4,000 lynchings that take place in the United States.
Lynching becomes a form of leisure for many who engage in it. The vast majority of people who lynched black bodies were not members of the Ku Klux Klan. They were, in fact, everyday, ordinary citizens. People who were young and old, men and women and children from all social classes.
They're often described as festivals of violence, where ultimately the entire community comes together to participate in what are called at various times picnics or barbecues, and often where photographers and the media are given privileged access so they can capture the violence.
Kodak invents the amateur camera at the end of the 19th century. And with that, we start to see photography become even more and more part of people's daily lives. Photographs of lynching start to appear in a host of different forms.
It became very profitable for photographers to take pictures of people being lynched, take pictures of the crowds, and then sell them on the streets. People could purchase the postcard as a piece of memorabilia from the event that they witnessed.
Bragging rights, so to speak. And this becomes a big business, where there are photographers who make a fortune selling these lynching postcards.
The photograph extends the life of an event. Very simply, when we think about photography, we think about time. It allowed a viewer to relive and re-experience that sense of power and control over and over and over again. They functioned as a form of ownership over Black people, even in death.
Black families were often under assault, and Black women were often lynched as well.
One of the only extant images we have of a Black woman who was lynched was Laura Nelson and her son in Okemah, Oklahoma.
Lynching postcards are traded widely, sent through the mail in the United States. It's how people communicate with their relatives. Where you were in relation to the body often becomes a sign of how influential or important you were. And people clamor to get to the front of the mob. One could be a celebrity if captured in a lynching photograph.
One surviving postcard is the lynching of a man named Will Stanley. He had been lynched by a crowd of about 10,000 in Temple, Texas in July of 1915.
On the back of the postcard is written, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with the cross over it. Your son, Joe."
That was written by Joe Myers, who was a local oiler in Belmead. There's a level of pride that we see in his association with this lynching. He is not shameful of it. He does not attempt to hide his attendance there.
He's sharing this as if he were sharing a postcard of the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower.
It widens the community of people who can take part in a lynching. It suggests that white folks thought that this was a story to pass on, a story to be proud of.
The reason those people are unmasked is that there's no fear that they'll be prosecuted for their actions. Even though there are photographs that capture the number of participants, when coroners' juries perform their duty by looking at the corpse of those who were lynched, they often came to the conclusion that the person had died at the hands of persons unknown. This was a euphemism for the lynch mob. But ultimately what it meant was no one was to be punished for these acts of terror witnessed on African Americans. It is terrorism in its clearest expression. And in some of the most infamous lynchings, including the lynching of Jesse Washington, it's also an example of the complicity of state and local government.
Jesse Washington was a black teenager from Waco, Texas. He was a laborer in 1916 when he was accused of the bludgeoning death of a 53-year-old white woman. Fred Gildersleeve was a local photographer who had arrived in Waco about 1905. Gildersleeve had told the mayor that he would give him a cut of his profits should the mayor allow him to set up his equipment previous to the lynching of Jesse Washington. And it was reported that the mayor was not worried about the injustice that was occurring outside of his office, but instead he was worried that the people who were burning Jesse Washington would damage the oak tree.
As the lynching is concluded, the city officials, the mayor and the sheriff suddenly begin to recognize that what's taken place here needs to be kept quiet. As they're attempting this cover-up, those Gildersleeve photographs become a hot commodity. Everybody wants an example of what took place in Waco.
Burning of the black body had become so associated with the way that black people were lynched in Texas that other states would say so-and-so had been lynched Texas style.
Whether it's of Will Stanley or Jesse Washington, the photograph doesn't tell us anything about what their living was like or what their hopes or dreams were. What we're looking at is actually an undifferentiated Black death.